Good morning again, everyone. In today's lecture, we are going to be mainly focusing on a bit of introduction into network security and an overview of the module itself. Uh, so, we will basically look at some of the areas that we will be covering in this lesson, but also some of the uh, uh, key topic areas and the way the module will be conducted. We will discuss about those as well. Uh, so, if we begin uh, by looking at some of the recent cybersecurity incidents that may have occurred. These are some things that you can easily look up. There are a couple of links provided in your lecture slides as well, so you can refer to those also. And something that you will be able to see is that um, the um, the nature of cybersecurity attacks, and more so the frequency of cybersecurity attacks, has become much more significant over the past years, past decade or so, and more so in the past 3-4 years, it has become even more bigger problem. And when we say it has become a bigger problem, it's not just a bigger problem in the sense of like the impact that these attacks have, but also who these attacks are targeting. We are seeing more and more attacks targeting governments. We are seeing more and more attacks targeting high profile organizations. But we are also seeing attacks targeting uh, individuals, individuals of different nature, targeted attacks at different individuals as well. So this is this is sort of the landscape where we are focusing on this particular module, network security, and we will look at some of the topic areas relevant to cybersecurity and network security in this module. And another thing that we can observe in the past years is that doing a cyber attack, doing a network based security attack has become very easy. So when we look at the beginning of the sort of the computing era and how various things were, uh, it was a significantly difficult task, or the level of knowledge that was necessary to launch attacks those days was pretty high, because people had to have a very good knowledge of the underlying computing system, the underlying hardware systems, the networks, and all. It was necessary to have much higher knowledge to have a attack on the network environment. But these days, that's not the case. We can have network attackers, people who are launching attacks with not that much of security background, or with not much of knowledge background. And the reason is, now we have quite a lot of tools and quite a lot of sophisticated tools that attackers can use to launch these attacks. So that means they don't particularly need any high level of knowledge. They don't need to have a lot of experience to be able to launch a sophisticated attack. Even if we think of some well-known attacks like a DDoS attack or something, these days, like, it's not very difficult to launch a DDoS attack. There are many ways there are many tools. You can pay for botnets, and then you can use them to coordinate an attack. So these have become much more accessible in the sense that it has become a lot easier to launch these attacks. So if we go back to the basics of security and the basics of computer security, you would remember the computer security triad, that is the three key requirements that we would want to see in information systems. So that is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And when we think of network security, again, this we would still think of the same principles of integrity, availability, and confidentiality, but about information that is in transit. So it's not just the information that is being stored somewhere, but we are also looking at information that is in transit when we are talking about network security. So I'm sure most of you would still remember the basic security requirements, what we really meant by these confidentiality, integrity, and availability. But if we sort of again revisit the topic areas, confidentiality is basically how we can protect against disclosure of information to people who should not know that information. So if we have something that needs to be protected in terms of secrecy, other people should know about that, only select people should know about that, then that is where confidentiality comes. So this is about either proprietary information, intellectual property, personal privacy. So for many reasons, we would need confidentiality in our systems and in our networks. When we think of integrity, here the requirement is about the information is not modified without authorization or without proper permission. So if we have some information and we want to be able to assure that that information is not modified, and the authenticity of the information can be ensured. And a related factor is that if information is modified, then the person who modifies the information should be able to be identified, and they should not be able to repudiate that they have made such changes, or the information was created by them or modified by them. So that is around integrity. And then availability is about our ability to access the information when we need to access the information. So all the three principles, we can apply them when we think about or when we talk about information that is being stored in some place. But we can also talk about that when we think about information that is in transit in a network. So, for example, if we think about network security, Their confidentiality is about, can somebody come into the network or and access the communication that happens through the network. When we think about integrity, uh, can somebody come into the network and access the information or access the communication or intercept the communication and modify the communication before it reaches the recipient. So if you are sending a message, can somebody come in and modify the message before it gets delivered to the intended recipient? Then availability is that if you are trying to access some information through the network, can someone block your access or can someone disable your ability to access that information? So that would become how availability becomes an aspect in network security. So the same principles can apply to information that is stored somewhere, but also they can apply to information that is in transit. So, in this subject module, that is what we are going to be focusing at, that is, information that is in transit on networks. Then we have another set of principles that we will look at as part of how we look at security. Uh, it's not just for network security, but in general, we can look at three other things when we are looking around security. That is, security attacks, security mechanisms, and security services. So, security attack is basically any action that can compromise the security of information. So, any action that can compromise any of the three basic principles that we identified earlier. So, if there's an action that can compromise confidentiality, integrity, or availability of information, either when information is in stored somewhere or when information is in transit over a network, that action is what we would identify as a security attack. Then, when we think about security mechanism, it is basically the process or the prevention mechanism, or not just prevention mechanism, the mechanism that we have to either detect, prevent, or recover from a security attack. So if we have a type of security attack that we know, then for that particular security attack, we can devise, we can design a process or a device to either detect that attack, prevent that attack, or recover from that attack. Then the third one is what we identify as a security service. And security service is basically, once we know certain security mechanisms and we combine either one or more security mechanisms, and if we implement them to particularly counter certain security attacks, that is basically the security service. So I want you all to take few minutes and think about a security attack, associated security mechanism, and a security service. So, if you think of a security attack, such as a DDoS attack, and A security mechanism would be some way of identifying this DDoS attack. So in this case, fingerprint authentication service, and then how you are going to implement that particular mechanism. It could be possible to implement that in a blockchain-based system or any other relevant system, but it's how that mechanism is implemented. So any other responses, any other ideas about security attacks, mechanisms and services? Any examples? Okay, so what is the main difference between a threat and an attack? So we have looked at security attacks, mechanisms and all. So now when we particularly look at security attacks, but we also hear about the phrase or the word security threats. So what is the main difference between security threats and security attacks? So when we think about security threats, it is basically anything that can have the potential for a security violation. So, if we have an environment, if we have a system, uh, and it has a potential for a security violation based on its the way that it's built, its features and its vulnerabilities, it has if it has a possibility of being in danger, then that is what we would identify as a threat. And a security attack is something that is actually exploiting the threat and using something against the system. Say, for example, if we have a uh, if we have a network that is unprotected network communication, if we have an unprotected network communication happening, then there is a threat of somebody exploiting that communication. Somebody either eavesdropping on that communication or doing some other type of attack on that communication. But only when they do something on that, that becomes an attack. So you can have an insecure computing environment or an insecure network environment, network communications, that we would see as the security threat, and we would see what are the threats. So this the using all the protocols, unencrypted communication, or not updating devices or firmware, and all these things can be seen as threats. But only when somebody exploits those threats, or only when somebody is particularly targeting some of those threats and trying to do something about that, that becomes an attack. And that is what we will focus more. But uh, in most cases, there is a tendency to use these two terms interchangeably. That is, using threats and attacks, the terminologies can many times be used interchangeably, and that is common, and that is also okay, because attacks are actually exploitation of threats, and if there is a threat, there is always the potential for that to be exploited into an attack. So these things in a way sort of coexist or can coexist. So even we may sometimes interchangeably use these two words or phrases. So now let's look at some of the basic types of security attacks, the sort of the common types of security attacks that we can see, uh, and particularly in network environments as well. So when we think about a network environment, say if we have two nodes in the network and we have a normal network communication. So that is the normal information flow that we see. Then the first type of attack is interruption attack. So what happens is the information flow is blocked between the information source and the information destination. So this is essentially an attack on availability. So because the recipient is no longer able to access the information. So essentially the ability for them to access the information is blocked. So that is an availability attack. The second one is interception. So with interception, what happens is the sender is sending something to the recipient, but someone is also trying to look into the information. So they are able to read the information, a third party, in addition to the information source and destination. And but they should technically not be doing that. So here it is about the private information being disclosed to someone who should not have access to that. So that is an attack on the confidentiality principle. Then the third one is about modification. So when we say modification, here what happens is someone is sitting in the middle and the communication is actually going through. So the information source is sending some information, but that gets to the third party before it gets to the recipient. So here they can potentially modify the information in any ways that they want, and that becomes an attack on the integrity of the information. And the last part is another attack is fabrication. Here, what happens is the source is involved in this particular communication, but someone else is pretending to be the information source and sending some information to the recipient saying it is coming from the source. So here the principle in question is the authenticity of information. Who actually originated the information is the issue here. So, can you think of an example for a interruption type attack? Um, a security attack that can interrupt your ability to access some uh, information. An example for that? Yeah, any DOS attacks, DDoS attacks, essentially they are availability, they are targeting the availability principle. Any example for interception? It doesn't have to be network based attacks, but any examples for either information in store or information in transit, an interception type attack? Yeah. Packet sniffing or key logging, yeah, those can be examples of interception. Then for modification, so any attack that targets integrity of information. Yeah. If an attack can go and modify or change some information in a data store, that can be an attack on integrity as well. So if somebody gains access to a database like a voting system or something, and they can change the records in that system, that becomes an attack on integrity. And a fabrication type attack, an attack on authenticity, an example for that. Yeah, something like email spoofing, phishing attacks, all these things can come under fabrication because somebody can pretend it is someone else, and if the recipient believes that, then that becomes an attack. So these are possibilities. All right, so let's move on. So, have you heard about the principle of passive attacks and active attacks? So, when we think about the various security attacks that we can have you come across the two different types of attacks that are known as passive attacks and active attacks? And if so, what do you think are the main differences between these two types of attacks? So, when we think about passive and active attacks or passive and active threats, the main thing that we are considering here is uh, uh, the nature of the attacks. And this is something that we would have briefly touched upon when we might have touched upon in computer security as well. Uh, but the main sort of difference is passive threats or passive attacks will not be doing anything that is interrupting the activities of the user or the target. Whereas active attacks will do some modifications or interruptions to the activities that is happening at the target point. Say, for example, if we look at, we can look at some examples to understand passive and active threats a little better. So, if we look at something like passive attacks, uh, the two examples that we can look for passive attacks is the release of message content. So, for example, if two parties are communicating, say the two parties in question here is Bob and Alice are communicating. So their communication is happening. That's one thing. But someone else is interrupting the communication and uh, uh, reading their messages. So here, the communication between Bob and Alice is not technically interrupted. They can still continue to communicate, but someone else is also now having access to the information. So that is one type of passive attacks. Their actual communication is not particularly impacted or interrupted here. In the case of traffic analysis, it's again a similar scenario. So Bob and Alice communication continues to happen, no issues with that. But now someone else is interrupting that communication or looking into that communication, observing the communication. So they are observing the patterns of messages and all that, and performing a traffic analysis. But still, the communication between Bob and Alice is not interrupted, and they can still continue to communicate without any problem. So this is the nature of passive attacks. So that is both the communicating parties will not be interrupted, or the targets of the attacks will not be interrupted. They will not be impacted by the attack, but the attack can happen in the background. So that is the nature of passive attacks. So then when we think about active attacks, on the other hand, they will have impact on how the parties involved with the security attacks are going to be impacted. So with active attacks, again, if we look through some examples, say again, if Bob and Alice are communicating, or Bob and Alice are the parties concerned here, but here there is a massive attack, so that is some third parties actually communicating with Alice pretending to be Bob. So they're not actually Bob, but they are pretending to be Bob. So that is an active attack, because Bob is not actually involved, but he is going to be impacted because someone else is pretending to be him. Then replay attack is essentially the communication between Bob and Alice is now interrupted by a third party, and they can potentially modify the messages between them. So again, here someone else is potential to actively interrupt the communication and potentially harm the communication. So they are not having a normal communication as they used to have even when a passive attack was happening. So their information flow is directly impacted here as well. Then another type of active attack is modification of messages. So again, this is the variation of the same thing. So again, the third party is sitting in the middle and potentially modify the communication. And the fourth type of active attack is denial attack. So here, the server is actively targeted by a DOS attack or a DDoS attack. So Bob is no longer able to access that server. So again, this is actually impacting their ability to access information. So that is essentially the main difference that we would see between passive attacks and active attacks. So what we essentially have is with passive attacks, what we have is we have two parties involved, or it could be one or two parties. And with passive attacks, the attack will happen in the background essentially, and it will not directly impact or make any significant impact to the users of the system or the users of the network. So they can keep on going as normal, but the attack will keep on happening, and then further harm can happen later on. Say for example, a keylogger on a system a network sniffing, packet sniffing on a network, or anything like that that happens in the background, because it's not going to impact you in any way directly, but it can still happen and it can have further consequences later on. Whereas in an active attack, it is going to directly impact your ability to use the system. Either it is going to block your communication, it is going to block your ability to use the system, something like ransomware, if it is going to block your ability to use files. So that is a very active attack because you can't use the system. Whereas in the case of a keylogger, you can still keep on using the system, but your information, personal information and all are going to be compromised later on or utilized later on as part of the compromise. So those are the two main ways that we can differentiate between active attacks and passive attacks. So authentication and access control are some of the most commonly used security services that we would come across. So that is to identify who the data relates to, who and the who part, and then also in terms of who can, again, access control is also about who can access the information part. So again, those two are very commonly used. Then we can have other security services related to confidentiality and integrity directly. So that is preventing unauthorized disclosure. So again, we can have certain security services particularly focusing on the confidentiality aspect of information, and we can also have security services focusing on the integrity aspect of services. So for example, encryption can be used for confidentiality purposes, and digital signatures can be used for integrity purposes. So these are some things that we have discussed previously in computer security. Then other things that again would relate to in these environments as security services are around non-repudiation. So that is not able to dispute sort of any changes or go back on changes. Then availability of resources, particularly around network availability and all. So any services related to DDoS prevention and all that could come under this category. So as we progress in this course, we may look into some of these things in much more detail, particularly authentication, access control and all. We will look into more detail, and some of the other concepts also we will revisit in much more detail later in the course. So then when we think about security mechanisms, we saw that security mechanisms are how we apply different security services. So what we can see here is we can have different security mechanisms, and the security mechanisms can utilize different security services or a combination of security services, or they can provide a combination of different security services. So if we look at something that you are already familiar with, if you look at digital signatures, for example, digital signatures can provide the authentication part, because who can use the digital signature, and it can also authenticate the origin part. It can provide integrity, and it can provide non-repudiation. Whereas if we think of something like notarization, that can only provide the non-repudiation part. It is not going to influence any other aspects. So some of the things can provide quite a few different aspects. Some of them are going to provide only a single aspect. So that is how we would see the relationship between different security services and mechanisms. So now let's look at an example or an example scenario to better understand these different things. So think of security threats faced by a village merchant. So think of, say, maybe even think about 100 years ago, and think of a merchant, a seller, someone who is selling goods in a village, can be town, wherever. But let's make it simple and think of a village merchant and think of what are the security threats that they would have faced in such an environment. So in this case, the main threat is going to be somebody stealing your goods from the shop, from the merchant's place. And uh, the way that we need to protect is somehow we need to protect the perimeter or the of the place. So there we can think of things like we can have locks. So if we have a place, if we have a shop, we can have locks. We can have locks at gates, doors, and all the places are locked up, so nobody can come in. So then somebody can come through the roof. So then how do you protect about that? So you think about the physical perimeter of the environment. So the same thing that we can do in network environments as well. So in physical environments, we will think of something, and in information systems network environments also, we will think of something like that. Then another scenario that we would come across in a shop environment is that uh, uh, because a shop is some place where other people need to come. So because like people, shoppers would still need to come, customers will need to come, so we need to let them come in, but we should not let robbers to come in. So how do we control that? The same problem we will also face in computing environments as well, because we are going to have legitimate users who need to use the system, but then we also have the attackers. We should allow the legitimate users and block the attackers. So if we try to block everyone, then the legitimate users also cannot come in. But if we allow everyone to come in, then the attackers will also come in. So we need to find a balance between the legitimate users and the attackers. So like we can't block everyone come into the shop, because like if we are too suspicious, checking everyone, blocking everyone, nobody will come into the shop to shop things, and the business will be lost. The same thing in a computing environment. We have to let some people in, but we have to somehow find a balance to identify and block that people who could be the threats, who could be the attackers. So that is something that we have to find a balance there. Then we can build certain mechanisms to identify or differentiate between these attackers and the legitimate customers. So in a shop environment, we can build certain programs to identify previously known customers, and then we can sort of trust them. So in a computing environment also, we can do something like identify certain ways, using certain ways to identifying certain people as legitimate users into our system, and then blocking others. So this is where we have the aspects of access control and things like that, to allow certain people into the system and then block certain other people out of the system. So essentially, what we see here is um, the way that we would apply the principles behind security, the various principles behind how we control these things are not that different when it comes to a village merchant or a very high security network environment. So the underlying principles and our thought processes are going to be the same. It is mainly the mechanisms and the security services that we are going to utilize for specific attacks that is going to differ, and that is the main thing that we'll have to think differently. But other than that, the underlying thinking process behind how we think about threats and how we build protections against different threats is still going to be the same, or it's going to be a similar mindset that we need to have. So, when we think about network security, this is something that we would quite often come. We have already looked at this in previously as well. But if we sort of expand on some of the terminologies related to this communication, what we would have is we would have a sender of information, a receiver of information, and they will send data and they will receive data. And then we will have a communication channel that we would use for communication, and through the communication channel we will send data and other relevant messages. So then what we essentially have here is a third party who could potentially be the risk factor or the attacker in this situation, who could potentially either eavesdrop or intercept or modify, or any type of attacks can happen between these two. So these are some of the terminologies that we would have when we think about network communications and network security. So if we look at that in a much more formalized manner, we can think of certain other components as well. So when we want to implement network security, so we have the sender who is sending a message and the recipient who should receive the message. So then if we want to establish a secure communication, what we need to do is we need to use certain security mechanism or service to transform that information into a secure communication message or secure message. So we need to do some secure transformation so that the message is now secure and anyone in between are no longer able to access that information. So then now if this information is going through the communication channel, if a third party is trying to access this information, they should not be able to see the message because the message is now secured. It is in a secure form, so they are not able to read the information. So this is where we can use, if we use an encrypted mechanism, so they are not able to break into the encryption and read the message. So then at the recipient end, so they will receive the secure message that is again still not readable by anyone else. But now they can utilize the security transformation mechanism that was used by the sender, and if they reverse that process, they can receive the information, the message that was sent. So this is essentially the model of security. And In addition to this, so some of the principles again we discussed previously in computer security as well. So this is where we can use public cryptography or something like that, or using a third party service to distribute the uh, way that we do the secure communication. So, but this is essentially the model for network security where we try to achieve a secure communication between two entities. So now, when we think about uh, security threats, so we will go a bit further and think in a more broader way. Uh, and we can think about security threats because before we go into how we handle these threats and what we do about these threats, we need to think about how these threats come about, why they come, and how they or which parts of the organization they can impact, and the boundaries of those threats, and so on. So there are a few questions that we can ask about these security threats. So the first one is how someone is coming up with the way to threaten the security. So if someone is doing like launching an attack, how did they know about the specific threat that they are exploiting to begin with? How did they learn about that? Did they learn from somewhere else? Is it public knowledge? So, how part is an important one because if someone else is learning about this threat and we didn't learn about the threat, then that gap needs to be addressed because if an attacker knows about the threat, the security professional should also know about the threat or they should also learn about the threat so they can better prepare and defend against that threat. So we can build the defense mechanisms against the threat. Then the second question that we have is about the security, about why someone is threatening the security. Because like how is the underlying knowledge about the threat? Because just because they have the knowledge, now that doesn't mean they are answering the question about that. The answers the question about why they are exploiting the threat and launching an attack. So these could be a number of things as well. There could be monetary gains. So they are going to gain some money, they launch a ransomware attack and get some money, or some other ways of getting money, transferring monies across whatever the mechanism. Or it can be some ideological thing. Say, for example, one nation state can launch an attack against another nation state, or one group can launch an attack against another group for ideological reasons like belief systems and various other things. So that could be the why. Why can be sometimes money, and some other times it can be other things, political things, or sometimes even people do it for the fun of it. No money, nothing, just because they want to show off that they can do an attack. So they may do that as well. So that is also a possibility. But these days, the money or the geopolitical factors are becoming more and more sort of important aspects about why threats are being exploited in the real world. Then the next question is if we think of an organization, which parts of the organization are at risk of which attacks? Because not all parts of the organization are going to be equally similar. So, because we will have different parts of the organization doing different things, because some may directly interface with external world, some parts of the organization are internal. Say that the interfacing with the external world, like through a web portal or face-to-face interaction, there are different aspects of a threat. Say someone who can receive external emails and things like that, they can be susceptible to ransomware attacks, phishing attacks, and all these other attacks coming through that way. Or even social engineering attacks are possible. And then another possibility is around uh, internal parts of the organization, so the back ends of the organization. So this is where we can have threats like backend servers and all. They can have various other threats being exploited against them, like someone is launching a DDoS attack against one of our servers. So something like that can also happen at a different parts of the organization. So what we essentially need to identify is which part of the organization is at risk and what is the specific risk that they are facing, because not all parts of the organization will face the same type of risk. Then another thing that we need to identify is what are the boundaries of the organization, uh, uh, the assets, or where the assets of the organizations are in terms of a physical boundary. So again, this has become a much more challenging environment these days, even when we consider computing resources. One is with more and more network connected services, uh, things like cloud based services or other service providers providing us a lot of computing services. Not all of our computing resources are in a physical location that is controlled by us. So, for example, if we run our own data center, we have everything within that place. We have some physical control. We can have some physical control in addition to our information security controls, network security controls. But these days, that's not the case. We will have some of the data hosted in a cloud service provider or some other data center, or we can have certain things, certain services totally provided by an external party, like email systems provided by one organization, accounting system provided by one organization, and all of our data will be in their servers, not at all within our premises, not at all within our organization. So these are also some of the scenarios where we will have issues in terms of how we can sort of manage that data when it is beyond our physical control. How we still can build security mechanisms to control them. So a lot of the network security, cloud security aspects would also come into play when we think in from this perspective. So those are some of the ways that we can think of security threats. So just because we know about a threat, we need to think of these questions to better understand the nature of the threat, how it comes about, why, how are the risks, what are the risks, and so on. So once we know about a security threat, then we can think about how that security threat becomes an attack. What are the steps involved in uh, converting a security threat into an attack, and that attack being launched into a particular target? So the first one is, say, if we sort of think from a network security point of view in this case, first one would be to is what we would identify as reconnaissance. So where we go into the environment and look for things about the environment, how the network is structured, what are the different parts, what are the entry points. So we look at all the things and try to learn about that environment. So in the if we go back to the example of the village merchant, in that case, someone can come into a shop pretending to be a customer and go around, look around, and see where are the doors, where are the gates, where are the different entry points into that environment. So that is reconnaissance. So you go in and look for things and try to get a feel for the environment that you are in about in that place. Then the second one is scanning. So this is where you go and do a bit more of that learning part. So you go and identify what are the things that you can actually use to exploit and get into the place. So, for example, you look at which are the doors that are not locked, what type of locks are used, how can you break that type of a lock. So, you look into that. So, in a network environment, also, you will scan for open ports and all these different things to do, identify what are the entry points you can utilize. And then you further go and to the next step of gaining access, actually gaining access. So this is where you will actually exploit one of those threats and gain access and go into the system. So this is where like breaking the lock and entering into a shop. So that is the part of gaining access. And once you have gained access, ideally you would want to keep on having that access. So it's not just accessing it once in a particularly in a networked environment, a computer network environment. It would be very beneficial if you can maintain the access for a long period of time until you can perform or you attack fully. So if you are stealing data, if you are copying information, you need to have that access for that period of time without anyone detecting that you have access, and you steal all the relevant information out of the environment. And ideally, once you steal the information or whatever the type of attack you perform, ideally you would want to cover your tracks and hide any evidence of your crime and go out of the system so that anyone if one is they are not identifying that an attack has happened. That is very beneficial, because if the target doesn't know that attack has happened, there are many benefits, because you can utilize that information much further. Say if you steal some credit card information, if they know that information was stolen, they can inform the customers and cancel the credit cards and on so on. But if you can steal the credit card informations and keep that keep the fact that this information was stolen away from the organization, you can have use that information, use the credit card information for much longer period of time and do more harm. So that is again another reason why you would want to hide your tracks and go out. And also you don't want to get caught to the law enforcement agencies and so on. So if you are performing such an attack, you should hide your tracks. Not that I'm saying you should perform an attack. So now let's look at some of the basic methods of defense when it comes to security, network security, and all that. Again, we will not go into details of many of these today, but we may revisit some of these things later in the course, and some of the things we have discussed previously as well in computer security also. So one of the key weapon that we would see in terms of uh, security is around cryptography. So this is where we can think about encryption, message authentication, signatures, and certificates. So these are some of the different things that we have touched upon in computer security, and they are they play a major role in network security as well as sort of control mechanism, as defense mechanism. So then in addition to that, we can build software controls. So this is where we build access control limitations and all these other software based control limitations. We can have hardware level control limitations, again thinking about smart cards or hardware based security modules and things like that. Then in addition to this, we can also have policy based things. So these are sort of technical solutions, but we can also have policy based solutions in an organization where we can the policies would identify who can do what and all that, and then we would implement that or enforce those policies using our technical stack. So we can have certain software, hardware, cryptography based technical solutions, and then we will have some policy based framework that would say who can do what, under what circumstances, and all these things are would be defined in the policy, would be identified in the policy, and then we would implement the policy using our technology stack, our technical solutions, so that those two things coexist. And in addition to that, we can also enforce physical controls, because in addition to the technical attacks, physical control can also prevent quite a lot of attacks. So either somebody coming and directly stealing information, or plugging into a network and trying to sniff out information. Quite a lot of things can happen if somebody gains physical access to an environment. So we also need to be mindful of the physical controls that we need to have to isolate our computing infrastructure, our networks, away from any potential attackers who may come through the way of direct physical access. They may not try to infiltrate through the network, but they may just walk into the office and try to steal some information if we are not very careful about that. And that can happen quite a lot with certain social engineering mechanisms and all that. So we have to be mindful of such scenarios as well. So now let's think about. So we have sort of briefly touched upon a various variety of sort of security threats, then security services and mechanisms. So there's quite a lot of things that we can do, like cryptographic based controls, software, hardware based controls, and so a variety of different approaches. So now the concern is, how much security should be implemented? Because like we can enforce, say, we can enforce quite a lot of things. Say if we think about something like in an environment, in an organizational environment, let's say we are implementing some cryptography based mechanism. So encryption is there, so message authentication, signature certificates, we are using all of those things. And then in addition to that, we are using some software controls, access controls, and time based controls, and all those things. Then in addition to that, we put on some hardware controls. You need to use certain smart cards and all these things to access, again, gain access to the environment. Then in addition to that, we have very strict policies about who can access what at what point in time, for what purpose, and all that. Then in addition to that, we put some physical controls, like limit who can access to what space, you can go into that room, this room, and all these very specific physical controls. So what we end up with is a situation or an environment where there's quite a lot of controls, or quite a lot of limitations imposed on the environment. But the problem with doing such a level of control is, it can end up with a situation where it becomes very difficult for a typical user of the environment, or of the organization, to do their day-to-day job, because they need to go through 5 rounds of signing in processes, gain permissions and approvals, and all these things. All these security mechanisms can be too much. So we need to find a balance between that. And also another thing to be mindful is, security through obscurity is a very bad idea. So when we say security through obscurity, what we talk about there is, just because you hide it from someone doesn't mean it is secure. Just because you keep it sort of in a separate place and say they will not know about it, is not a great idea of security mechanism. So obscuring something or hiding something is not always the great idea. So I mean, like, not hiding as in encryption, but hiding as in just putting a piece of cloth over something and hiding. That type of hiding is not a great idea when it comes to security. So we have to find a balance, and find a balance with suitable mechanisms. And this finding the balance will also be balancing the cost of things, cost of doing business. Because again, implementing security mechanisms can be very costly because uh, all the different security measures that we take can be costly, and certain security threats and attacks can also have a cost. So, if we look at that through an example, let's take an example of a ransomware attack. And in our organization, let's say if a ransomware attack happens, the amount of money that we would lose is, say, $5,000. So we will have a loss of $5,000 worth of information and business and everything if a ransomware attack happens. And we can also purchase a ransomware prevention system, or someone is selling us a ransomware prevention system that is going to cost us $10,000. So the attack is going to cost us annually $5,000 if an attack happens. Um, um, the potential of the attack, the frequency an attack can happen, we can make a calculation of potential loss, and that calculation is, say, $5,000. And the solution we have is going to be $10,000. So in that case, that $10,000 solution is not suited for this environment because that is too much of money, because like we can spend less even if we lose everything in that attack, and our loss would be much less. Whereas in some other organization, their loss may be higher, so this prevention mechanism may be more suited. So this can be based on different organizational types, large, small, different environments. Say someone in a sort of high security type of organization will need more security, and others may need less. So we have to find the balance between the security measures, how much it is going to cost, and how easy it is going to be the end users within the organization. So it has to be acceptably easy as well for the end users. So when we think about security attacks and prevention mechanisms, uh, it is essentially a question of permit and deny. So at the end of the day, it boils down to the question of who we allow to do what or not allowed to do something. So if we think about an organization, when we think about an entry point, that is who can enter or not enter the organization. It could be entry point to the houses or any environment. It is about who can access and who should not access, who is permitted to do something or who is denied to do something. But sometimes it can be very tricky to decide whether we permit or deny something, because it can be a very fuzzy situation, because it can be a very confusing situation. Again, let's think about a scenario. That is, you get a call from the bank. So you get a call from the bank, and the person from the bank is telling you, or the person on the call is telling you that there is a suspicious activity on your credit card. So the caller is saying, I'm calling from this bank, and there is a suspicious activity on your credit card. I need some information to block that card. So now, oh, there, now the question is, are they actually calling from the bank? Should we answer them and continue talking to them? Can that be a phishing attack and they are trying to get some information out of us? Can we trust and give them some information, or should we not trust? But if it is actually the bank, then we lose some money. Our credit card is going to be misused. So there are a few different competing things that we will come across. This is a simple scenario that many of us can think of, but we will come across this type of dilemmas, this type of situations when we encounter security environments, when we think about computer security environments. So in those situations also, we will have to make these judgment calls between who to permit, who to deny. So it is not always a technical problem and a technical solution, but in many ways it's also a psychological problem and a psychological solution. So the way that we think about something and how we approach that problem and solution. And finally, when we think about security, when we think about computer security, when we think about cyber security, network security, we are always going to be in the situation of what we would identify as in an arms race. So that is, there's going to be new threats coming about, new attacks exploiting that threats, and new countermeasures for those attacks or countermeasures for the threats. So, as a security practitioner, we should one of the things that we will need to do is always keep up to date with the latest threats and attacks. So then, if we need to keep up to date with different security threats, security attacks, then the next question is, who do we trust? So there could be different people publishing information about threats and attacks, but can all of them be trusted? Can all the information that we find online about threats and how we protect against threats, would that be suitable to do? Say, for example, you look for something, they have given some code, say, run this program, everything will be secure. How can we trust that? That activity itself can be part of an attack potentially. So the trust is something that should be very hard to come by because the consequences can be very damaging. Then, which sources should we believe? Then about information, and also which sources should we believe about updates? For example, we always say keep your software up to date, keep everything up to date. But how do we know the updated version of the software is actually correct, or that cannot be a problem? Because if you may remember about last year, sometime last year or a little before that, there was a major attack in the US targeting a particular software vendor. I think it's called SolarWinds. So anyone who was using the software received an update to their software from their update server. So it came from the organization itself, so nobody else was providing these updates. But the problem was the organization itself was compromised. So whatever the updates that they were receiving or they were sending or pushing to customers was a compromised update which had a malware, and then that went on to do certain other harms later on with all the organizations using that particular software, SolarWinds, I think. So that is also a trouble because we would trust the software vendor to give us updates, but sometimes can that update be malicious as well, or can that include some malicious components as well? So again, this is a question that we will have to think hard and try to resolve before we proceed with some of those activities. So it's essentially the lesson that you would have to get from this is that don't trust anything, don't trust anyone. But if you are trusting something, do it with some reason and reason out some logical reasoning that you can give to that. So we will go into discussing many of these things in the coming weeks. But for today, I'm going to give you an activity for you all to do as homework. And what I would expect is you do this as a one-page document thingy, and I'll put an upload on LMS so you can upload it there. So what is expected is because like as security professionals and all that, we can look at everything in organizational point of view and all that, but information security, data security is also about our personal information. So look at, think about those things. What are your digital footprints? Where your information is stored? You use a cloud server, cloud storage provider. You have social media places where you will have your information. You will have some older digital footprints, like in older computers, hard drives, older backups that you no longer use, older devices that still may have your information. Uh, um, and if somebody is thinking of stealing some information from you, how can they do that? So think about those things and also identify what are the ways that you can protect again those different places where your information is stored at. So you can simply put it in a table form, like saying like what are the information and where that is stored. But as with a security professional or the expectation of a security professional, don't put any personally identifiable information. Just don't even put saying like which cloud provider will have your storage information or whatnot. I mean like I'm not going to reveal, but I'm not the authority of information. Somebody can hack into the LMS and steal the information about you. So don't put any personally identifiable information, but just a summary of your digital footprint and what are some of the threats against those different points of data, and what are some of the ways that you can protect against that particular threat. So just a one-page summary, a small table would be enough, and you can upload it on LMS later. That's all for the main discussion for today. Uh, do you have any questions or concerns that you would like to discuss at this point? So, if there are no other questions, we may conclude the lesson for the day. So we will continue next week with more topical discussions for first few weeks, and then we will go into discussions on different topic areas after that. So I will highly encourage your participation in upcoming classes. And until next time, thank you for joining today, and see you next week. Bye.